All right, so I thought I'd talk about this Polygon article about Malenia from Elden Ring, titled "Elden Ring's Malenia embodies FromSoftware's problems with women." Damn, that was some clickbait right there. The game's strongest boss betrays the developer's biggest weakness. No, is the answer to that. I was going to read lots of passages, but I think I'm just going to do this one paragraph because you can read. I'll link to the article. You can read it for yourself. It's one of those articles I feel like that says a lot without saying much at all. It's wordy and obtuse. It hides its lack of substance in a lot of flowery prose. I'm not saying that the author, Nico Deo, I don't know anything about Nico Deo. I'm not saying they're a bad writer. It's fairly well written. It's got many a nice turn of phrase. It's just odd, the argument being posed here, which is, again, that Malenia proves that FromSoftware has a problem with writing compelling, or with, not compelling, but with writing, with its portrayal of women. So here's the paragraph. I might read more than this, but we'll see. Malenia exemplifies the way FromSoftware writes women in its games. So that right off the bat, exemplifies. This is an exemplar of how FromSoftware writes women in its games. Whether bosses or NPCs you meet in the wild, these women have a shared condition. They exist in tragically declined worlds, sharing a specific brokenness, disfigurement, abandonment, and loss. I will just point out, and I think that I would say 99.99% of everyone who's played any Souls game or Elden Ring, regardless of your political positions, would agree that all the characters in these games have this problem. They all exist in a tragically declined world, and they all have some form of disfigurement, brokenness, abandonment, loss. They're out for revenge. They've gone mad. They were fine for a while, and then they go mad. Like, these are not happy games. Even happy endings in these games aren't particularly happy. These are games about a cycle of birth and rebirth, death, decay, rot, rebirth. They are afflicted by gender. Well, now, that is a claim. What does that mean? Let's see. They are afflicted by gender, and the cure for when they are obstacles instead of mutely helpful is for the player to enact succinct violence. Again, setting aside afflicted by gender, which I'm not sure what that means yet, we haven't been told, all characters who are obstacles rather than helpful or mutely helpful, and even sometimes who are helpful, you meet them with violence in this. These are games about destroying bad guys. And when you finished your run, before you end and go to New Game Plus, going around and killing all the good guys too. Although in Elden Ring you can do that with less consequence since you get the ball bearings. They are afflicted by gender. We have not found out what that means yet. Okay, it is a particular kind of idealized femininity, as fantastical as the foreboding castles and giant trees, demure, quiet, void of needs or motivations, an echoed presence of dolls, mothers, and even helpmeets who guide the player along. There's some of that I could see. There are demure, quiet, void of needs or motivation female characters in these games. I would say that there are male characters who fit similar, if not exactly the same descriptions. There are certainly very mute male characters. But Malenia is not demure, or at least she's not. She's not quiet. And let's read this next bit. Their emotions are muted in their more docile counterparts before erupting into a shrieking, horrifying hysteria when encountered in combat. You know, Malenia doesn't really meet any of these descriptions. She's calm and collected throughout the fight. She is certainly, to some degree, sexualized. She is naked in the second phase when she becomes the goddess of rot. But her nakedness is not necessarily a sexual nakedness. I would say it's more of a, and I don't even know if platonic's the right word. She's a god. Her nakedness is immortalness, but it's also, it also reveals how she succumbs to this rot. Like at one point, in this article, the author describes her genitals and breasts as smooth as a doll's, but really they're covered in rot. Like it's showing how rot is covering her. Literally, it's what's clothing her. And she doesn't erupt into shrieking, horrifying hysteria. In fact, many female bosses do not erupt into shrieking, horrifying hysteria. Many bosses don't at all. A lot of bosses stay rather calm even when they're kind of terrifying. And some go to that horrifying hysteria. In a lot of this article talks about the community's reaction to female characters, suggesting that they like the female characters in these games because they're docile and emotionless, or they're because they're looked on as sex objects or something. But here's the thing: like in video games, as in other forms of entertainment, people are going to look at characters and sexualize them. It doesn't men and women both? Maybe women more than men. But I mean, I was just. You could see fan art of like YouTubers. Like I was reading about that Dream guy who showed his face, and there's fan art sexualizing him. So anybody can be sexualized, and the idea that men only like these female characters because they're docile is absurd. A lot of these characters, a lot of fan favorites, including Malenia, who is a fan favorite, is anything but docile. Or even emotionless. I would say that Malenia's story, where she goes to Caelid to free, she thinks Michaela has been taken by Radahn, and they fight, and she ends up, erupting the scarlet rot all through the land and sort of bringing that doom to Caelid and to Radahn, when actually it was Mog who took Michaela, and it's all this whole thing. But and this article gets it wrong. They weren't fighting to be Elden Lord. They were. It seems, I think, more likely that they were fighting over a misunderstanding. But it's FromSoftware, so there's a lot of interpretation and there's a lot of vague stuff. And I think that's another thing. Like, I think the reason a lot of these characters are enjoyed, whether again male or female, is because you can imprint so much of what you want onto them. If you don't dive deep into the lore, then you're probably not going to know that much about them. Their stories are very vague, and you only get bits and pieces. And even then, you might get a little bit, and then you're in this fight, and you forget it right away. I mean, I've had that happen with countless bosses. I get there, they talk some, I forget all about what they just said because I'm trying to stay alive. And by the time I kill them, like what I remember most about them is the visuals and the move sets and the powers, and with Malenia, it's quite stunning. And I would say that reveals that FromSoftware's treatment of women, while there are certain repeating themes, yes, like mothers and dolls, and I think these themes actually weave into their larger themes of cycles repeating, rebirth, and all that stuff that I talked about earlier. I think that Malenia is an example of someone who is not overly emotional, but certainly has emotion. Someone who is a badass and beautiful, but also terrifying. Someone who's not docile, but also not hysterical. I think Malenia is actually a fascinating and well-crafted character, and I think that using this character as the exemplar of FromSoftware's problems with writing women is not a great idea. She talks about the reaction of the audience or the gamers to the punishingly difficult fight and how it's gendered toxicity, but I would say that you just see that in all games. That has nothing to do with FromSoftware's portrayal of these characters. No matter how they portrayed this character, you would have some gendered toxicity. That's just the way it works, especially on Reddit and YouTube and Twitter and all that. There's this bit about, the bravado about beating Malenia makes sense. She evokes the idea of a virginal warrior like Joan of Arc, her purity and strength existing in a place beyond femininity. When faced with a difficult, defiant woman who has never been beaten, men cannot help but fantasize about being the one to take her down. Again, this is like stuffing gender studies into this discussion without actually rooting it in anything that is specific or applicable to FromSoftware games. There are countless very difficult bosses that everyone fantasizes about beating. It has nothing to do with them being a woman. They could be a dragon. They could be a giant. They could be whatever the fuck the Elden Beast is. It's not because you're fighting like some defiant woman who ought to be in the kitchen. It's because you're fighting a demigod. You're fighting a sorceress. You're fighting a witch king. You're fighting, whatever it is. You're fighting something very challenging, and you want to overcome that, and that's the whole point of the fucking games. The author talks about like how there's clone spores of Malenia and how that's just putting her in a box as a mother again, which I think misses the point rather badly, and I'd say the point of FromSoftware games where there are fathers and mothers, and it's especially Elden Ring is extremely familial. All these mothers and fathers and husbands and wives and brothers and sisters in this whole like super messed up. It's like Game of Thrones, right? I mean, it's George R.R. Martin is a part of writing this. There's going to be these themes that doesn't actually weaken a female character to have part of what she is a mother. I mean, I don't think Malenia's core defining features are motherhood. But the author argues that these narrative choices swiftly undercut her initially provocative design, cheapening their impact. What's the scariest thing a team of designers could dream up? A distant warrior woman who doesn't care about them, slowly succumbing to a rot that infected her from birth. While Malenia's character writing has grown slightly beyond the way women were written in earlier FromSoft games, her arc is still confined by the same laws. What could have been a place for mechanical and narrative evolution backslides into being merely a means to an end within a video game. Women continue to populate the path as either passive helpmeets or predictable obstacles, which the fan base is all too happy to step over. Just like all the male characters in the game. Every single character in the game is either an obstacle or an helpmeet. An NPC of some kind, a quest giver, a merchant, a boss, some combination, an NPC that turns bad. While FromSoftware's games are often intriguing meditations on the corrupting influence of power, the inevitability of death, and the lurking dread of cosmic horror, the women in them feel stunted. Malenia is a half-grown idea clipped back too short. What could have been is left on the floor of the halig tree, cocooned in petals and deeply dreaming of revenge. I mean, I think this final and very nicely written paragraph undermines the entire article, honestly. I mean, what could have been is left on the floor of the halig tree, cocooned in petals and deeply dreaming of revenge is fucking cool sounding. Like this character who has been through so much and has done so much damage and is now cocooned away, and who you come to and is the goddess of scarlet rot. Like, that's a really cool character. That's so much more than what this article is crediting this character. And at the same time, the article is describing exactly what is, like, at least aesthetically, and that always aesthetics play into the deeper themes and meanings of these games, why this character is actually a total badass. So that's all I'm going to say here. I think that this idea that women are afflicted by gender is kind of silly. Are some of the women in these games kind of repeats of other women in previous games? Absolutely, but so are some of the men. I don't know, because this article doesn't say what this author would like FromSoftware to do differently. What could have been? What could have been? You don't say. You can't say that they continue to populate the path as passive helpmeets or predictable obstacles. That is a lot of alliteration right there. Because that just describes everyone in these games. And if you have a problem with the storytelling itself in these games, then just say so. But this afflicted by gender, it just feels like, I don't even want to call this clickbait. I mean, it is kind of clickbait, but I think it's also trying to dredge up a problem where none exists, or using the wrong example of a character to make this argument. And maybe this argument would be more compelling if you looked at some of the characters who were maybe more docile, passive, who didn't speak, who weren't. Maybe you could make a better article out of that, or maybe not. Maybe there would be a good argument against it. I'm not gonna go into hypotheticals right now, but taking one of the coolest designed bosses, one of the toughest bosses, one of the most respected bosses, a boss that inspired people to go all get all like fanboyish over Let Me Solo Her, which is just a player whose entire Persona is built around being able to beat this boss by himself. I mean, that says that this boss is one of the the most beloved bosses, and not because she's docile, and not because she's passive, and not because she's emotionless, but because she's and certainly not because she's naked, but because she is just a thrilling boss with an incredible design and a really fascinating backstory if you dig into it at all. And yeah, some fans are going to be sexist, and there's going to be gender toxicity, and there's nothing FromSoftware can do about that. And it does not justify an article criticizing FromSoftware for the portrayal of women, but never actually getting to the root of what that problem is. So that's all I have to say about that. Thank you for watching. Peace.